So hello. This is our special Juneteenth version of Crucial Conversations. We are not going to be meeting on Wednesday since most of us have the actual holiday for Juneteenth off. But we are so grateful to be able to continue on with our Crucial Conversations this month. Hey, Ruben. So this month we are really grateful to be able to celebrate someone who literally has moved, shaked, um, lifted mountains, wove things into community, and really just lifted up Black folks here in the city, the state, and beyond. And so we're extremely excited to have Ms. Tinisch Hollins here. She is going to be speaking about all of the important work that she does, continues to do, and has done. She is a community staple here in San Francisco. She is a friend. We're funny. I say mentor. I learned so much from her. I learn so much from her. And even when she doesn't know she's talking to me, she's talking to me. And so it's really, really an honor to have her here to talk with us today around this conversation. I'm going to let Andrea do her formal introduction. But if you don't know this woman, I'm telling you, you want to click into these two organizations and make sure that you get to know her, because she is a phenomenal woman. She is a phenomenal speaker. She is a phenomenal community activist and engaging, and she will lift your soul. She will lift your community, and she continues to do great work. So I'll pass it on to Andrea so she can do a formal introduction.
Hi, everyone. I'm Andrea. I'm with Black Women Revolted Against Domestic Violence. Thank you so much, Tinisch, for hopping on today. I want to give a brief introduction about the great work that she does. Tinisch Hollins has over 2 decades of experience in community organizing, guiding government systems, and informing public policy for social change. She's a skilled critical thinker, public speaker, and facilitator, using her training and lived experience to build understanding and practical solutions for community well-being. Hollins has shown leadership in violence prevention and social and racial justice, transforming strong partnerships with communities and stakeholders in California. Currently, she serves as the Executive Director of Californians for Safety and Justice, a leading criminal justice reform agency. Under her leadership, CSJ has passed significant legislation to protect crime survivors, remove barriers of those with old records, and fund violence intervention, trauma recovery, reentry, and community-based solutions. A survivor of gun violence herself, Hollins is also the State Director of Crime Centers of Safety and Justice, representing over 50,000 members in California. She has testified before the California legislature to support survivors and was appointed to the Flexible Assistance for Survivors Admission Committee by Governor Gavin Newsom in 2022. In June of 2020, she co-founded San Francisco Black Wall Street to increase Black ownership and preserve the Black culture in San Francisco. In 2021, she was appointed the vice chair of the San Francisco African American Reparations Advisory Committee. In 2023, Governor Newsom appointed her to the San Quentin Transformation Advisory Council to help transform the state prison into a rehabilitation center by 2025. So without further ado, I'm happy to introduce Tinisch Hollins, our guest speaker today.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for that generous introduction.
We so appreciate you being able to join us. So for those of you joining us now, we've got several questions for Tinisch with all the wonderful work that she does. And you will have the opportunity to ask any questions you may have for her at the end of our session. So to get started, as the Executive Director, could you tell us a little bit about your organization and your work with crime survivors for safety and justice?
Yeah, so forgive my voice from a long weekend or week of partying and hosting Juneteenth celebrations. You're getting the best that I have right now. So if you need to turn your captions on, please do that. um, but so I joined the Alliance for Safety and Justice is the organization that I work for, and I've been the executive director of our state-based program, Californians for Safety and Justice, since 2021. I came on as ED in 2021. I actually started working with this organization back in 2017. And this was a couple months after my second brother was killed in San Francisco. I've lost a total of 3 siblings to gun-related deaths, different circumstances with each of them. But in 2017, after I lost my second brother, I got introduced to Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice, and they're a network of victims and survivors and surviving family members from across the country, but they had a membership here in California. And a lot of the families and individuals who were part of this network, I had already known them from community, doing work in Bayview and in the city, organizing to help homicide victims, family members, and other survivors. What spoke to me about the work that CSJ and Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice and this whole national organization was doing was the fact that they were centering Black and brown and underrepresented victims in their conversation about how to change the criminal justice system. And I thought that was really important, being that a lot of people who are victims from our community or have been a victim of a crime or a survivor of a crime have also been touched by incarceration or by the criminal justice system. That wasn't a conversation that was brought up in that way at that time, but it was something that spoke to me, especially having lost 2 brothers at that point, both who died while they were on probation and were supposed to be receiving services to deal with other trauma that they had experienced. Both of them had also been victims of gun violence. So understanding that, as a surviving family member, both what my brothers experienced that I think led up to their deaths, but also what I experienced and what my family experienced trying to get help and trying to get justice after those incidents, the work that CSJ was doing really made sense to me because you couldn't have one conversation without the other. So I came on as a chapter organizer, bringing other survivors in the Bay Area together to be a part of these conversations, to come up with solutions on how we could create safety in our communities, but also make sure that our voices were in this conversation about what to do about crime and violence. And they convinced me to leave my full-time job with the city, come on board as the state director of our survivor network. So the first 3 years that I've been a part of this organization, I spent going around the state, meeting with survivors and survivors' family members to learn more about their stories and to get ideas on how we could change policy to help survivors from our community. And then in 2021, I came on as the executive director of the organization, leading not only the survivor work, but also leading the criminal justice reform work in the state. So that's been kind of my journey in working in the organization.
I love that they scooped you up from your full-time city role, but I also just want to highlight how central it is that we're bringing in people directly impacted by the issue and that you already know in community to call in to work together for a solution that works better for all survivors, including those that we don't typically speak about, which are those who are already systems impacted in regard to the criminal justice system. So your other role is equally as important as a co-founder of San Francisco Black Wall Street. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so SF Black Wall Street was founded in June of 2020. And this was right around the time of the uprising in response to the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery. I mean, we were at a moment in time where the whole country was forced to stop and witness what Black people had been saying for generations that we had experienced when it came to policing in our communities. But we also were experiencing the pandemic, which was a different level of trauma and disconnection, I think, that everyone was experiencing at the same time, but the Black community, specifically the Black community in San Francisco, was experiencing in a different way. If you know anything about the city, then you know that our population of Black folks has declined over the past several decades. And at one point, they estimated that we were about 3% of the population. When I was growing up in the city, we were closer to 20% of the population. And we had whole neighborhoods that still had a lot of Black representation. Well, when the pandemic came around, we started to realize, one, that we had no spaces to come together in the way that other communities did. Two, I think we were forced to stop and look at the number of businesses and cultural spaces that we had that were just gone from our neighborhoods. They had either been shut down or they were threatening to be shut down. Organizations that existed were being underfunded, and our community was experiencing the pandemic and the uprising with George Floyd in a different way. So 7 of us came together. We, grew up in the city. We all had ties to each other, family ties, community ties, long histories. We were also the people that, for better or for worse, when our community needed representation or needed advocacy, we were the ones that they would often look to because of our different backgrounds. I had worked in city government for a long time, but also worked in nonprofit. Jafria, who is a co-founder of this organization, is also a co-founder of SF Black Wall Street. And there's 5 others of us in the city who came together and brainstormed about ways that we could try to help the community at this really important moment. So the first thing we did was we called the community together for a huge Juneteenth celebration. It just happened to be that the uprising and everything was taking place around this time of year. And Juneteenth felt like the right time for us to try to pull what was remaining of Black San Francisco together. So we did that at Gilman Park, very, what's the word, grassroots. We found a place in Bayview and put up a post on Facebook and had people come and drop off donations to us to host this community picnic. We had over 1,000 people show up to the park on that day, and then decided that we needed to continue building, and that we had 3 areas that we wanted to focus on, because we know that there are a lot of community organizations doing great work, but there seemed to be gaps in these 3 areas. So we focused on Black business, Black ownership, and that included Black home ownership, business ownership, and cultural space. Because the big issue was that we didn't feel like we had any places where we could come together safely and feel welcome, which is crazy in a place like San Francisco that's so well known for its diversity and for the money and resources that are here for Black people who have had so much, who have given so much to this city, to not feel welcome or not have space here and see businesses shutting down. So we came together and formed this movement that later started an organization in 2021 that I am now the co-director of, along with Gwen Brown. And our organization now has a program where we've helped over 70 Black entrepreneurs in San Francisco start or scale their businesses. We also host a number of cultural events, including for the 4th year this year, our annual Juneteenth celebration in Bayview, a Juneteenth gala, the 415 Day. And the idea behind all these things is not just to celebrate our culture, but for us to create a network where Black people and underrepresented folks in San Francisco can do business and build entrepreneurship and build that community. So really proud and excited of the work that SF Black Wall Street does and continues to do, and to be able to represent it. And we're also very, very much still heavy on the advocacy for Black San Francisco, but also for San Francisco overall. We all deserve to be able to live, work, play, and afford to be in the city that we help create.
Thank you so much for speaking on the importance of that network, because if you don't have it, knowing how to start is so difficult, right? Speaking of networking and flipping back to your other hat, last year, the executive directors for Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice participated in Survivor Speaks in Sacramento, California. I know this year Survivor Speaks is actually going to be held in our nation's capital, Washington, D.C. So for those of us who don't already know, what is Survivor Speaks, and what are the primary goals this week as everyone convenes in DC?
That's a great question. So to tell you a little bit about Survivor Speak, I got to give you a little bit of the origin story of this organization, the Alliance for Safety and Justice. This work started in California. The criminal justice reform work started in California. And at the time, the work was really centered on reducing the jail and prison population. And the majority, we know, of folks who are in jail and prison, overrepresented, are Black folks and Latinx folks. So as we were having this conversation about how to change the system, we couldn't have it without having victims and survivors who were also from those same communities be a part of that conversation. And so what Californians for Safety and Justice did from the very beginning was begin convening victims and survivors from community to inform their policy, and then engage them in the advocacy, actually create space for them to come and tell their stories, to lawmakers and decision makers and influencers to help them understand why it was important to bring victims and survivors' voices into the conversation about safety. And this was important not just because we wanted to craft good laws and impactful laws, but because for the past 40 years in this country, most of the victim advocacy organizations were represented by non-people of color, specifically white women. And so the policies and laws that were created to protect victims and survivors were biased because they did not reflect the needs of victims and survivors who were Black or from Latinx, who had language access issues, who come from communities that experience higher rates of crime and violence, which meant that the policies that they were creating for victims and survivors only covered certain groups of victims and survivors, mainly folks who were victims of sexual assault, human trafficking, domestic violence, but certain types. So we noticed from the very beginning in doing this work, if we're going to create policies around safety, if we're going to advocate around safety, that we need to bring the people who are most harmed but least represented into this conversation. And that's how Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice started. From 2012, they started pulling together numbers or groups of survivors and bringing them to the Capitol to be a part of this conversation during National Crime Victims' Rights Week. At the time when they started, there were no other victim advocacy organizations that had people of color that were coming to the Capitol. So CSJ started building this network to make sure that survivors could come to the Capitol during this National Crime Victims' Rights Week, which is a national opportunity that survivors all across the country would come and advocate these victim advocacy organizations. We wanted to make sure that our community was seen as in that, represented in that, that we were also able to be seen as victims and survivors and that our voices were heard in that. So what started off as something very small with only 12 survivors in 2014 has grown to an annual event where we bring almost 700 survivors to the Capitol every year. In the years since I have been around in the organization, it grew from maybe 400 to about 700 survivors that we bring from all over the state, whether folks drive in or they come in on our CSJ member buses, or they live locally here in the Bay and they drive up, or Northern California, from all over the state, as far as San Diego and as far north as Eureka. Our survivors will come to the Capitol for a 2-day event. One day is a conference and day of healing, where survivors will get to be a part of sharing their story or hear other survivor stories. They'll be able to break out into workshops and things like that, have an evening gala because we like to party and celebrate the fact that we have survived, right? And that our sharing our stories is powerful. And then on day 2, we go to the Capitol and we advocate, and our members actually sit down and meet with lawmakers to share their stories and talk about why we are advocating for the policy changes that we're advocating for, or for the resources to go to our communities the way that we need them to create safety. So we've done this every year for the past 11 years. But this year, we're doing something different. So for National Crime Victims' Rights Week, we did have our annual convening in Sacramento. It just looked a little different. We had a 1 day of advocacy where we brought survivors up. But that is because in September, we are bringing about 700 survivors to Washington, D.C. And this will be the first time that we've done this. But in honor of the 40-year anniversary of the Victims of Crime Act and some other very significant federal actions for victims and survivors, we are bringing our survivors to the nation's capital. Because much like all of the other National Crime Victims' Rights Week events leading up to this, we have not seen Black and brown victims and survivors of crime in the nation's capital being a part of the conversation about what to do around safety and what support survivors need. So we're going to be bringing our survivors to the Capitol for 2 days. We're going to run the same play, right? We're going to have an amazing opportunity for our survivors to network, heal, and share their stories, and then take them physically into the Capitol to meet with national lawmakers around what our survivors need across the country.
Quite the undertaking. Thank you so much for sharing how you give survivors the opportunity first to sort of like center and ground themselves in each other, right? That importance of seeing yourself and the community around you before you go to do that ask for lawmakers and legislation. On the subject of current legislation, what are some current California and national policies that you are either working on or supporting with crime survivors for safety and justice?
So, for the past couple of years, CSJ has really been focused on expanding rights and protections for victims and survivors in a couple of different areas. One is around protecting employment and housing. We know that whenever a survivor or a family member is impacted by a crime, it destabilizes their lives. And many people are surprised to learn that there are very few laws on the books that protect victims and survivors when something happens, specifically their housing and employment. They don't have protected time off to handle their healing or relocation. They don't even have protected time off to grieve. And when we have met with survivors, all over the state, all over the country, overwhelmingly, especially from our Black survivors and our Latinx survivors, we learned that people will experience one of the worst tragedies of their lives, like losing a child or losing a partner, or losing someone in their immediate family to an act of violence, and then return to work the next day because there are no legal protections for them to take time off of work, or because they have to save whatever time off from work they have for the actual funeral and the aftermath, which is, I don't even have a word for it. And for many of us who have lived that experience, we know how traumatic it is and how much more pain and trauma it inflicts on ourselves and on our families when we don't have that. So we are working diligently every year. We have passed several pieces of legislation to give survivors protected time off of work. Now, not just for victims and survivors, but for anyone in the state of California who needs to take time off for bereavement, they have 5 protected days. I know that's not a lot, but it was better than none, right? 5 days off that your employer will have to allow you to take off for bereavement. That came from CSJ, directly from our survivors. Also, the ability to break a lease if you're a victim of a crime. I know too many survivors who are forced to stay in an apartment or in their living environment, whatever that may be, because of the penalties associated with breaking a risk. So we have people who lived literally in the scene of a crime, but were forced to stay there because they didn't want to have to deal with having an illegal eviction or termination of lease on their records or on their credit reports. So we passed that law. That was directly from our victims. We passed Curtis's law last year, which a mother who lost her 16-year-old son in San Diego worked for 9 years to get this law passed. In 2 years, she worked with us and we were able to get it through. But this would require law enforcement to give information to the parents of a minor child who's been killed. Like, could you imagine that that wasn't a law until our survivors came forward and said, you need to respect and give dignity to people and understand the level of trauma that's experienced when people don't have information about their loved one, but specifically when it's a minor child, right? We're also working to make sure that people can get their property released, right? When they've been a victim, the property can be released to their immediate family. So these are all very basic common sense laws, right? And then when we dig through and find out that some of the legislation that was on the books would provide some protection and support, but only to victims who had certain crime types, not to victims of gun violence, not to victims of, who are overrepresented, Black and brown victims who are overrepresented in certain types of crime. One other big thing that we're working on this year, we were able to launch a campaign called We Are Survivors. And when I get to the end, I'll share some links that I think would be great for you all to check out on your own. But in 2021, we launched a campaign called We Are Survivors. And this is mainly because during the pandemic, there were a lot of victims advocacy groups that were advocating for more police and more sheriffs and more arrests because there were victims and survivors who were being harmed. Some of them trapped in situations because they couldn't move during the pandemic, or because response time was slow when there's a crime because of the pandemic. And so a very small group of victims and survivors who were partnered with law enforcement were using their voices to call for more policing and to call for stricter punishments during the pandemic. And our survivors came in and said, how about you actually take that money and create more access to shelter for people who need to relocate, or take that money and make sure that people's immediate needs are being met. Like, people can't meet with their therapist during the pandemic because they don't have Wi-Fi and they don't have phones. They're off the grid, especially if they live in the hood or in disenfranchised communities. And these traditional victims' rights groups pushed back on our victims and called them criminals, literally said that you all represent criminals, you're not real victims and survivors. And so we launched a campaign so that our survivors could share their stories to help people understand why we were advocating for the things we were advocating for, but also so that our survivors could claim back their identity. Nobody wants to be a victim for the rest of their life, but when you're Black, you cannot be considered a victim. And at one point in this country, that was literally written into law, that you could not be considered a victim because you were property. So the spirit of that has continued for decades, generations in this country. We launched a campaign so that our survivors could tell their stories and say, we are survivors, and here's how we know what we know, and here's why we're advocating for what we're advocating for. We filmed a documentary. We took the documentary around the state. We shared it with lawmakers. We shared it with people locally. We brought other survivors together for healing so they could watch the documentary and share their story. And through that, we advocated for $50 million to be put to the side to create a fund so that victims and survivors could get direct cash assistance, because too many of our victims from our communities cannot access victim compensation because they're not considered to be victims. So in addition to this campaign where we were able to share our stories, we actually pushed the state to create a new fund, since we couldn't get access to victims compensation fund, called direct cash assistance. And to demonstrate that we needed this and that it worked, I took $110,000 out of our own organization budget and subgranted it to small organizations who worked with survivors across the state, many of them that were led by victims themselves, survivors themselves, so they could give cash to people who needed to move during the pandemic, help them relocate, get them car seats, help pay for tombstones, headstones, whatever it is that they needed, to show that this is why we are calling for these funds, because it actually creates safety, not just for victims, but for everybody. And the state understood, so they approved that $50 million and put it to the side. Right now, all of the work has been done to launch this program, but due to the state budget shortfall, the governor has postponed those dollars. So we are actively advocating. Our members are calling and writing letters to the governor's office, meeting with legislators. When we were at Survivor Speak in April, our survivors went around and met with lawmakers to tell that story again, to help them understand why this was important. So all of our stories live in law. That is the work that CSJ does. We translate our stories into policy. We translate it into advocacy. We turn policy and advocacy into healing so that we create more access for our folks.
Thank you so much for sharing that last policy, because I can't imagine ever being in a position referring a family to victims' compensation, right? And then having them learn that they don't qualify and feeling stuck, right? Because I don't think that's something that general workers know in this area, that there are situations in which a family would not qualify.
There are many situations in which a family wouldn't qualify that's important for people to know. Number one, if your loved one, if you or a loved one who was a victim of a crime also have previous criminal convictions, you are ineligible for state victims compensation. It doesn't matter if the crime that you experienced is not related to whatever your past conviction was. It could have been 20 years ago, but you are ineligible because you were once a criminal, so you can't be a victim. That's state law. And we have been pushing against that every single year that CSJ has been in existence, because I would say, can you imagine? But I can, because this was a situation that my own family experienced. Both of my brothers were formerly incarcerated and on probation at the times of their death. My family did not qualify for state victims compensation. The second thing is that a police report has to identify you as a victim in order for you to be eligible for state victims compensation, which means you have to cooperate with law enforcement. You have to cooperate with an investigation, because if you don't, how else will they name you as a victim in a report? So for many Black and brown specifically victims who cannot cooperate for safety reasons, for a number of reasons, they are automatically excluded simply because they wouldn't cooperate or couldn't cooperate. And or if the law enforcement at the scene of the crime and the investigators determined that maybe you had some involvement. This is another exclusionary practice. Now, who determines whether or not you had involvement? Law enforcement. And who is there to defend or impact the dynamics of whatever happened in that? Only the victim, right? There's no representation for them. So they're basically put on trial before the case is even heard. So these are real barriers to state victims compensation. The third kind of final hurdle of this is that state victims compensation is a reimbursement-based program, which means you have to pay out of your pocket first. You need to provide all of this proof and evidence of your victimization and your costs and expenses. You have to go through a process with the state to approve that, and then you can have it reimbursed. What happens to people who don't have those funds, right? Especially if they cannot work, they're in jeopardy of losing their housing, any stability that they have. How would they have funds to spend $10,000 to relocate or to bury a loved one, right? And those are safe estimates. We know what the real cost is in California for those types of things. So unfortunately, these are little known barriers and little discussed for a couple of reasons. So one, if the primary victim advocacy groups don't have representation from Black and brown victims and survivors, how does that show up when you're doing outreach to victims and survivors and community about the resources that are available to them or the barriers that they might experience if they're trying to get help? And then for victims and survivors, the majority of people from our community are completely unaware that any of these resources exist. In San Francisco, when you're a victim or a survivor, we have a little bit more of an infrastructure because survivors like myself or advocates like Jafria and folks from other parts of the community who've been working in violence prevention and intervention for decades have close proximity to city government. We are a city and a county. So we are able to communicate to our DA's offices or to our mayors or to our local electeds about how we need to address this to keep communities safe, which led to our counties creating specific funds from the county level that can be used to support victims and survivors. But at the state level, that doesn't exist, right? So it is important not only for us to understand all of that, but it's equally important for our survivors to be able to share their stories about their experiences of trying to get help, trying to navigate what happened to them and get to safety, because in those stories, you're going to better understand where the technical barriers and legal barriers are for our people getting support. And that helps us change laws, that helps us with advocacy, helps us make sure this stuff is accessible at home.
Thank you so much for sharing the strides that we've made as a city and county and how far we still have to go as a state. Focusing on joy, I just wanted to ask you, what was the significance of San Francisco Black Wall Street hosting its second annual gala in honor of Juneteenth?
Yeah, well, my voice I'm sure you can tell by my voice that Black joy is important, not just for the gala, but for everything we do. I think the significance of the Juneteenth gala is a couple things. So one is from SF Black Wall Street's inception, we were very, very intentional about not only creating cultural space, but creating unapologetically Black cultural space for us to express joy however we felt we wanted to express it. And that's difficult to do in a place where you feel unwelcome. And just by you convening, having groups of Black people together is a safety risk in San Francisco. Has been, right? From gang injunctions, like if 3 or more of y'all in the same place, the police have a right to come and question who you are. And if you are affiliated with certain people, you can go to jail, right? If you're from the same neighborhood, standing in the same place, and you're on the same case. That was the law in San Francisco, right? And it was overrepresented. There were Black people overrepresented in that. So it was very important for us to push back and be like, we're going to create space where we keep each other safe, and that this isn't all about labor and work, that it is just fun. It is just connection, because that is healing and that is safety for us. And it does create an opportunity for us to think about what else we can do. We give each other permission. SF Black Wall Street literally exists to give, or to remind and inspire Black San Francisco that we have agency, that we have permission. We've given ourselves permission to take up space, to look good, smell good, have fun, pull out our cars, dress down, dress up, whatever it is that we're doing, because our culture is the bedrock of San Francisco culture. There is no Frisco culture without Black culture. And that's historic, right? The founding of San Francisco, for people who don't know. The city of San Francisco was founded by a biracial Black man, and his name was William Leidesdorff. William Leidesdorff established the first hotel in San Francisco, the first school, the first business on the San Francisco waterfront, laid the framework for the streets that we know and the neighborhoods that we know in San Francisco. He was a consulate to Mexico. And then we had Mary Ellen Pleasant, who was one of the first Black millionaires in San Francisco, and used the wealth that she did through real estate and silver to fund the Underground Railroad, bringing people to California. And these are stories that our people never learn. I'm born and raised in San Francisco, product of San Francisco Unified School District. These are things that we didn't know. And I'm saying all that because the purpose of the gala is to validate and affirm our right to come together and participate in the luxury of Black San Francisco. What people see from the outside, this is the birthplace of the gold rush, right? Like, we are the wine and cheese capital of the world. We also have a Black population here who anchored this culture. And while we do a lot, 9 times out of 10, when the Black community is invited to participate in something, we're only working. We're working, we're tabling, we're cooking, we're doing the labor, right? We're doing the promotion, we're bringing our culture, we're dancing, we're celebrating, we're attracting, but we don't get to participate in the benefits of that. We are not celebrated in that. We're not invested in, right? 9 times out of 10, we're not even paid well or compensated for any of that. So the spirit of the Juneteenth Gala was to push back on all that and said, no, we're gonna use this funds to create a space for Black people to come and look good, smell good, feel good, and be good, and remind ourselves and remind this city that we don't have to labor to justify being able to do that. We are simply coming to celebrate like everybody else does. We are coming to celebrate Black excellence, Black joy, and Black freedom. And I think whether we were doing the gala or the Juneteenth picnic at Gilman, or kicking it in front of Cafe Envy, or whatever it is that we've done over the past 4 years that we've been in existence, we take that same energy to every event that we curate, because we want to remind Black people that it's okay just for you to come and have joy. It's okay for you to come and cut up. It's okay for you to come and, put your gold on and shine up your car and be too loud. It's okay for you to do that, right? And so the Juneteenth Gala, it was beautiful on a level that I can't even describe to you, something that you just have to experience. But one of the most beautiful things about the gala is that most of our people got to enjoy it for free, right? They got to enjoy it with a complimentary ticket. They had white glove service, right? They were served the best soul food by Black caterers. They were Black florists and a Black event planner that made sure this event was aesthetically top tier. I've gone to many galas and events. I've had the privilege of being invited to things all over the country, and I don't know one that rivals the Juneteenth Gala that we throw in San Francisco. And we do that for our people. And I'm just I'm still getting calls and text messages even right now while we're in this session from people who are sending me pictures and saying thank you. And, you know, there was a brother who called me yesterday. He said, I just wanted you to know that I go to a lot of different events and I always look over my shoulder, and I don't care how nice the event is. I've been to a symphony and look over my shoulder. He was like, but to go to an event in my city with my people, and I didn't realize until I was driving away that I didn't look over my shoulder one night. Y'all made me feel safe. That meant everything to me. That's why we do what we do. Whether it's the Juneteenth Gala or, you know, Gilman, hell, even fighting with Filmo to make sure that the festival in Filmo came back, and it came back right. You know, we have all these different rivalries, but there is no competition. Like, this is all complementary. We want Black people to be able to enjoy. Y'all have never seen Juneteenth in San Francisco crack the way it did this past June, and we're still going. So we got more work to do, but I'm very proud of it.
Just want to say hats off to you and your team, because that feeling of being invited, right? Intentionally being invited, and then just joy and safety in that experience is just such a high bar. And it sounds like you guys met it, and you're only seeing the ways to go up from there.
Definitely.
Stepping back into your role as the State Director for Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice, you've already spoken to this a little bit, but what are some needs you see for survivors of crime and their families, as well as services that are available to them that are just not advertised well? You wouldn't know where to start.
Yeah. I mean, there's still a lot of needs, right? Like, I think we've done a good job bringing this conversation to state level. We have 58 counties in California, and all of them are different. And I think the other thing is, at state level, it takes a lot to make things move. The other challenge we have is making sure that once things move, that they're accessible to organizations like Black Women Revolt and others around the state that actually have a connection to the community. So that is one of our biggest challenges, right? Is that we continue to advocate and share stories, and we continue to try to push to expand services. One of the other things I left off that CSJ has championed is expanding funds to create trauma recovery centers. And the flagship for the trauma recovery centers in San Francisco at what's now called Zuckerberg Medical. But the trauma recovery center model is basically a model that creates immediate access to victims and survivors of crime. No questions asked, no money required, no insurance required, but they can get access to therapy, they can get home visits, they can participate in support groups, they can get medication, they can continue to receive services either one-on-one or, you know, and all the other offerings they have for up to a year. And they can wait for up to a year to access them. They don't have to do it right away. That's important, right? Because I can remember my own experience. Half the things that people were saying to me when my brothers lost their lives in that moment, I can remember half of it anyway. Trauma won't allow your brain to process those things. So 6 months later, it matters. A year later, it matters. Sometimes 6 months to a year later is when it's finally starting to sink in what you've experienced and the impact that it's having on your family. So I think there's a couple of different things that we have to continue building. One is, I keep emphasizing how important stories are, because that's how we learn where the challenges and where the opportunities are to help our survivors. And what we're learning from our stories is that we still have whole communities of people, specifically the Black community and Latinx community and immigrant communities who are non-English speaking, are still cut off from getting victims compensation or getting support when they're in immediate crisis. The other thing is, survivors still need help right away. They don't need to go through a bunch of hoops, fill out a bunch of documents, you know, do a bunch of interrogations and investigations. You have to think about like biological science, right? That we are incapable of being able to do all those things when you experience that level of trauma. So we still have a long ways to go to make sure that people get immediate help, that we have flexible dollars for people to use. What might be an immediate priority for me may not be an immediate priority for Pam, even though we experience the same crisis, same family, same community, right? But there's no flexibility for how we're able to help respond to the needs. In the narrative right now, especially in this moment, because there's a huge conversation going on right now about public safety, especially as people are campaigning. Public safety is the platform that everybody's trying to stand on. How much do you hear the needs of victims and survivors being referenced in that conversation? It's almost non-existent. They're talking about fentanyl. They're talking about the need to criminalize people for petty theft. They're talking about, homelessness, right? And criminalizing people for being unhoused, or mandating people into treatment. All of these things don't necessarily create long-term solutions. And the needs of victims and survivors are not named in there at all. And if they're not named, that means that they're also not a priority for the resources that will come if and when these laws are changed. So it's important for organizations like Black Women Revolt and for those of us who are survivors and advocates to keep bringing that to the front, because the only time you will see victims, advocacy groups, or survivors being pulled to the front is when they're trying to justify policing and more resources going to law enforcement. It might be true that law enforcement departments are understaffed, but it's also true that without creating immediate support for victims and survivors, law enforcement can't do their jobs. Survivors are more likely to cooperate or more likely to participate in processes to get justice when they can move to safety, when they can take care of their kids, where they don't have to worry about whether or not they're going to be able to eat, or that they have to protect themselves from whatever danger might come from their participation, whatever that looks like. But nobody's talking about that, right? The only time you hear it is when they're putting a victim in front of the camera to talk about something horrible that happened to them and how they didn't get justice. Real justice is prioritizing what victims and survivors need now and preventing it from happening in the first place. So I think that it's an important part of the conversation that's missing for us. Like, yes, we should have lots of avenues for justice, but we also need immediate support for survivors. And we need that to be flexible, and we need that to be led by people who have connection to community, and we need those services to be housed in community. Doesn't necessarily have to be in a DA's office or a family justice center, especially if that creates barriers for victims and survivors from our communities. Let's make sure that people have access to that help and we meet them where they're at, because that's going to create safety. So that's the advocacy work that, we continue to do. And, pushing for legislation. We do have 4 other bills that are in the legislature right now, but those bills are important. But what's equally important is that the local level, how are we working to remove barriers for survivors right now? Right, while we're working on these big changes, what can we do to make things more accessible for people right now? Because the story is the same now as it was 15 years ago when I lost my first sibling, or 2 years ago when I lost my last one.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to share your experience with us, with how your family story informs the work that you do, and all the amazing things you have on deck, both in advocacy for survivors and with San Francisco Black Wall Street. At this time, if anyone in our audience has a question for Tinisch, I would love to open up to you if you want to raise your hand or drop it in the chat.
Pam, I don't have a question. I know Tinisch pretty well, but I do have something I do want to say. We forgot and would be completely remiss to not acknowledge the incredible amount of work that you did on the SF reparations hearings and the recommendations. And if no one has celebrated you this week, I want to say thank you so much for that, even though we have not managed to move forward in San Francisco. The recommendations that you all have put forth have resulted in those 60 students that are here in San Francisco, with the HBCU satellite campus currently taking place. And so I want to thank you, because I know it was not easy work. I want to thank you because I know the telephone calls that you received and the harassment and the crazy comments and all of the things that you had to endure during that 2-year period in speaking up for our people and trying to affirm our people and to make sure that our voices were heard here in San Francisco and across the nation, because it became a nationwide voice. And I do want to really thank you for that and really acknowledge that, because as we watched the news yesterday with the first breakfast with the students, and seeing the reality that we can do great things here in San Francisco, and seeing that we can create a satellite environment and that there are people who are here to support that, and affording those opportunities to San Francisco children who may never get to go across the country to attend a HBCU, but bringing that experience to San Francisco and bringing those students that are currently here to experience San Francisco is something personally I never thought I would see in my lifetime. And so I want to commend you for that, because without your hard work in the committee, that would not have been occurring. So we don't want to close off without mentioning that. So thank you, Tinisch.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, I'm very proud of the work that we were able to do on the committee and the recommendations. I also want to say that the work is not over, right? Like just, there are things that we wished would have happened as we advocated for the creation of the Office of Reparations, but it didn't stop just because that wasn't approved. The work that the HRC has been leading through the Dreamkeeper Initiative, bringing the HBCU students to San Francisco is one example of that. We are still pushing for cash repair. I think Supervisor Walton actually introduced some legislation today that's going to be heard in committee very soon. And so the work continues, right? The biggest piece of the work that we have to do is the public education about what reparations is and why we are calling for it, and to remind community that it will not stop. Like, it is going to happen. Reparations will happen in our lifetime, and it is happening. And I appreciate that the ways that, even with the limitations, that certain folks in the city are still working to try to actualize some of the recommendations that we have. But the truth is that the real meat of those recommendations are going to require a lot of pushback in the city, not just for cash repair. We put recommendations in there to protect or to provide, more resources and support for people who were involved in the war on drugs, right? Victims of the war on drugs, families that were separated, Black children that were separated from their parents, right? Through the foster care system. Specifically people who, not just people who were wrongly convicted, but people who were convicted and then disenfranchised, right? Who can't get access to housing. 80% of the population that's unhoused in San Francisco has a criminal background, and over 35% of them are Black, right? Like, all of these things are connected, and every city agency in San Francisco has an equity plan that they are out of compliance on. And so while the Reparations Advisory Committee is no longer active, the work of reparations in San Francisco is very much still happening. And I appreciate you bringing that up, because it's going to take all of us to continue to push that conversation and look for the opportunities, even as you all are doing this work. There's been a lot of harm done, specifically in the domestic violence arena, from advocacy groups, both in California and nationally, that has directly harmed the Black community, right? And so I've had several DV organizations reach out to me about ways that they can incorporate reparations practice in their organizations and in their advocacy. And I think that you have a great opportunity to continue leading that work. So I'm excited about what that means for us. And we got a lot ahead of us, and we definitely need help.
I'm gonna pivot to Kriya. I saw you had a hand up.
Yes. So first, Tinisch, I've known Tinisch for many years, and so honored to work in proximity to Tinisch's work, and witness just her brilliance and the brilliance of SF Black Wall Street. As a San Franciscan, I know that so many of the harms that have been done to the Black community have been really preemptive, and we're actually feeling the repercussions of years of decisions that were made, sometimes 10 years ago. And so my question to you, and I know there's no perfect answer, but I really, would love your thoughts, Tinisch, on like, if you can pick two things that San Francisco city officials, elected officials, even advocates could do today that you believe could salvage or support Black young San Franciscans tomorrow, 10 years from now? What are two of those things that you believe are crucial to ensuring that the young people that are in San Francisco, Black young people today, have a place in San Francisco?
That's a great question. I think it's one of our challenges right now, right? I think what would benefit young Black San Francisco is the same thing that would benefit any Black San Franciscan who has a tie to San Francisco, and that is we have to craft opportunities and even policies that directly benefit only Black San Franciscans, right? Like we can say, if they had access to jobs and opportunities, but we don't have the legal protection of making sure that those jobs and opportunities are prioritized for young Black people in San Francisco or for Black businesses. I think the Dream Keeper Initiative has made great attempts to be able to do that, but that's not even protected, right? So there's a lot of different things that have to happen to give us the ability to prioritize and protect a class of people in San Francisco. And right now, there's no legal avenue for us to do that. But what I will say is other communities have found ways to do it. And so we have to do that in San Francisco. We need to be thinking about crafting initiatives, crafting policy, advocating for budget line items that are going to narrow down the people who are most harmed and least visible in San Francisco so that we can make sure that they directly benefit from them. The things that we've been able to do through Black Wall Street are an example of it. And like I said, the other funded programs in the city are doing their best to try to make sure we prioritize, Black businesses and young people or elders. And what I find is that many of the folks who get access to our programs then go to the next program and get access to get support, and then to the next program. And that says to me that we haven't created an economic floor to hold our people in San Francisco. So I could say, yes, let's give access to something, but the truth is, unless we are going to radically redirect resources, specifically money, to Black San Franciscans and to young Black San Franciscans so that they can stay here, so that this is not just, based on, affordable housing or, certain initiatives. Like we have to find a way to create an economic floor so that folks can stay here. The majority of Black San Francisco is subsidized. Like our businesses are subsidized, our housing is subsidized, our employment subsidized. So when those subsidies go away, like what's happening right now, right? What's happening right now is that programs are being defunded or underfunded, right? And many of these programs received an influx of cash during the pandemic because we had additional federal dollars that came to San Francisco and to the state, right? To try to create, and people created programs, they created organizations, they created jobs for themselves and jobs for their families and people in the community, and those things are going away. So I think what has to happen, I can't oversimplify it by saying, if we just had more jobs or we just had more housing. What it's going to take is a radical reprioritization and redistribution of funds that are specifically for anchoring Black San Francisco. And that has to come from a public-private partnership. We have to have flexible money to be able to do that, because that's the only thing that's going to give us the agency to prioritize the people who need it the most. If we could do that, we're going to see some amazing things happen. We've been able to have little glimpses of it through the things that we've been able to do, whether it's through the Black Wall Street or the work they're doing at Booker T, or through the DKI initiative. Like we've had demonstrations of it, but we haven't had enough of it to scale it. So that's why the reparations work is so important, because it creates a legal opportunity for us to say, you have to pay this group of people, you have to build this infrastructure for this group of people, right? So there's a lot that has to be done right now to make that happen in an environment that's very vulnerable for Black people, and specifically Black San Franciscans. And yes, you're right. The courts, it's not just the courts that are trying to cut off equity programs and initiatives. Like there's a divestment from doing anything that's an equity centered, right? But racial equity centered stuff. Some of it is a backlash from George Floyd and from the Black Lives Matter movement. Some of it is, you know, funds being rerouted to invest in things that are going to make both the government and philanthropy more money. But again, the Black community is vulnerable because at this point, the remaining population of Black San Francisco is here on a subsidy. It's only because we have city and county funds or some fund that is creating an opportunity for us to stay. What happens when that goes away is the erasure of Black San Francisco. And we can't keep depending on just that.
Absolutely. I do want to raise that you mentioned earlier sharing some resources with all of us. Are you able to share those out and tell us what they are for our participants?
Yeah, so I'm gonna drop a couple of links into the chat. One is if you're interested in learning more about Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice and the work that we have done or continue to do here in California, across the country, visit CSJ.org. You'll also get some information on Survivor Speak in Washington, D.C. And you can find your local chapter. So I'm going to drop the link here for how you sign up if you're interested. We have chapters, I think 9 chapters across the state. We do have a San Francisco chapter and we have an East Bay chapter. So folks in our Bay Area region can definitely get connected to our events, to our chapter meetings, to get on the list so that they're informed about the conference when it takes place next year, Survivor Speak. So really excited about that. For SF Black Wall Street, 2 things I would recommend is one, if you're on Instagram, please go follow us. I'm gonna put it here because we've had some transitions on our social media platforms over the past year or so, but you can follow us at sfblackwallstreet_.org, or you can visit our website. And our website is where we post the link and information about our Black Millionaire Development Program. For our community events, our cultural events, Instagram is probably best. It just takes a lot of work to update our website. But if you want information about the Black Millionaire Development Program, all of that is there. And then when the applications go live, the applications are also on our website, and we'll be updating the website as we go. But Instagram is probably the best place to hear what we're thinking, what we feeling, and what we got going on. For CSJ, and I know it gets confusing, but Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice is a program within our organization. Californians for Safety and Justice leads the work for our victims network, for our Time Done network, which is our network for people who are living with old records, and leads our policy work in the Capitol, and I head that for the state. So if you are interested in learning more about what we're doing, especially as we push back on this public safety narrative that we are pushing back on right now, follow us on Instagram, safeandjust.org. There's a lot of things that we are sharing that I think are helpful for people to understand what's going on right now. And you can visit our website for Californians for Safety and Justice. And there's some great resources on this website. When it pops up, we actually have a link to our California Victims Agenda. And I think this is something that's really important for your network, your survivors and your leaders to take a look at. When we created the We Are Survivors campaign, we also took the time to create a 10-point plan to address the needs of victims and survivors. And so a lot of the things that I've talked about, from access to victims compensation to discrimination for people who have old convictions, to forced cooperation with investigations, we took the time to put recommendations on what the state can do to change those practices in this victims agenda. And our partners across the state have used this in their advocacy. They've also used it as they're writing grants or narratives to help folks understand. There is data. We've done a lot of data and a lot of research, policy research and otherwise, on the recommendations that we make. We don't just make them out off the fly. So this is a great resource for you all. It's been a great guiding document for us as we continue to advocate and educate people on what the barriers are for victims and survivors. So our websites are pretty decent places to learn more about the work that I'm leading. And then the last one is the Reparations website for those of you who are interested in following up or learning more about where that work is, or even seeing the report. The website is sfreparations.org, and I'll drop that in the chat too.
I just want to say thank you so much for uplifting that San Francisco chapter, the Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice, or the East Bay chapter for those of us who are on the call and would love to connect with other survivors in that way. I also want to shout out that last bit that you've just highlighted about the California victims agenda as we move forward. And thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Does anyone have any more questions for Tinisch before we all go back to our busy work lives?
Just grateful your voice held up.
Me too. Slowly coming back. But thank you all for having me and for taking the time to.
I just wanted to say I had a time this weekend. I had a time. I'm still tired from
Right.
Friday all the way to Sunday.
Yes, I'm right there with you. I had to peel myself out of the bed this morning. I literally stayed in bed all day yesterday because I could not move. But it was well worth it. Well worth it. And there's more happening this week too. I think there's a Juneteenth celebration in Fillmore, a smaller one at the Cultural Center on Wednesday, and I'm pretty sure we'll be out cutting up somewhere later that night. So let's keep celebrating. It's also Black Music Month. It's Pride Month. June is a good month to party. So I hope to see y'all outside when I recuperate a little bit more. But thank you for having me. And oh, happy birthday, Kriya. Show is Gemini season for y'all. About to be Cancer season for others. But
I'll
thank
be
you
on
so
the bed
much.
next month.
Let's go, Pam. You know we are overdue.
Yes.
All right, y'all. Thank you for having me. Thank you to everybody who tuned in. And I appreciate all the questions, and I hope this blesses somebody, inspires somebody, helps somebody, points them in the right direction.
This will be emailed out to our list, as well as I think we're going to try and add it onto our webpage. And of course, you all are free to do whatever you would like to do. It was an important conversation, and we truly are honored that you chose to spend this time with us and sharing all of the important work that you're doing.
For sure. Y'all take care.
Thanks, everybody.